My name is Isabel Dominicis Dewey. I live in Tampa, Florida, and I received the Circumnavigators Foundation grant in the summer of 1997. My topic was social issues in times of different regime or policy or parties changing in a variety of countries. When I traveled around the world, I started in Florida, then went to Japan, then went to Singapore, then went to Greece, then went to Spain, made that stop in France, the UK, and then back home. I do regret not having gone to more countries. Although, a trip as a 20-year-old who had never really been outside of, I had visited Spain with my family once, but we were not travelers by any means. So I was a bit conservative, and I wish that if I had done the trip over that I would have loved to have stopped in Russia or gone to China. Or headed into Africa, and unfortunately I didn't do that. There's a vivid moment where I am actually on the flight from LA to Japan. It was a direct flight, and seeing the little dot of the airplane crossing the Pacific and thinking to myself that everyone I know is in the state of Florida, and here I am, like I'm going across the Pacific to Japan. I love the architecture of Japan. I love the nuances in Japan, the quirky things, that have become like the cat cafes and all of that, the Harajuku area, the beautiful, beautiful architecture in, what's left of the older kind of historical parts in the city of Tokyo, and also in, some other towns, and then also just how exciting and vibrant, and the electric lights, the energy crossing the street, all of those things that I had not been exposed to. What surprised me after being in Japan is how Western Singapore was. And I did not anticipate that. I thought it was going to be more similar to Tokyo. And Tokyo is very safe. It's clean, but it's also, very Japanese. Where when you get to Singapore, it's a hybrid of East meets West, where you have, amazing food, but it's like being in a cleaner, more organized version of like a New York City. There was a time when I was getting off the subway in Athens. A few things struck me on that trip. This was before Greece hosted the Olympics. I got off an airplane, a flight from Singapore to Athens. I remember just kind of being taken aback by seeing everything in Greek lettering. That was something that, even when I had traveled in Asia, there were things in English. And, trying to figure out my way around, again, before cell phones and the internet. I also, one of the life skills that I had in that trip, and this is going to sound silly, but I way overpacked for my around the world trip, and had a suitcase, like a carry-on size, like full of shoes. And then I had a bigger suitcase with all of my clothes. Thankfully, I've become a much savvier traveler since then. The garbage, like the waste collection union in Athens, was all on strike. I had managed to get to the stop in the subway that where I was staying, and I actually stayed in the home of a circumnavigator. And pulling up both of my suitcases plus my backpack, obviously looking foreign, and just being kind of taken aback by just what a change in environment that I had been in, especially coming from a place like, Singapore, that is really, really clean. Everything's in English. And I was coming to, a much grittier Greece than we know now. So the experience of going to Spain, as a 10-year-old versus a 20-year-old by myself, was starkly different. Spain has a phenomenal culture of camaraderie and kind of a little bit more laissez-faire than what we're used to in the U.S. I like how starkly different the different regions of the country are. I also took a flight and went to the Canary Islands, which I had never been to, and was just able to see, from the northern part of Spain, which is almost in topography like an Ireland, to the southern part of Spain, which is obviously it's on the Mediterranean and pretty similar to Greece. And then, traveling to the Balearic Islands that are very mountainous. And what I also found interesting is that some of the nomenclature is very similar to Cuban Spanish than like Castilian Spanish, which I had not really known before my trip. So the Spanish that I learned growing up very much allowed me to get by in Spain. They absolutely. And when I went to France, my high school's French didn't cut it. But I did find that people often spoke Spanish, and I was able to navigate around that way. So one of my fondest memories of my summer was I actually had secured housing through Florida State University, which is where I was attending, and they had dorms there that were used for their study abroad programs. So I was able to use the foundation grant and spend my time in London staying at FSU, which was pretty practical. The campus is in the West End, and one of my favorite memories is, any afternoon that I, wasn't busy, I would hit up a single student ticket and got to see a variety of plays, almost everything actually in the West End over my few weeks in the UK. As part of my trip to Singapore, I did a day trip to Malaysia, which is, right across the bridge and very easy to get to. This was pre-internet being a part of our everyday lives, and shame on me for not doing research, and was just wearing a knee-length dress. I'm not very tall. I'm 5'6", but in Malaysia I was this large woman of lighter skin, and it was, people would grab me. I was touched and just throughout the entire day. It was actually the most outside of my comfort zone that I have ever felt, and that lesson of I was safe and then made it back to Singapore that night. But in my professional life, I've traveled quite a bit to India and another variety of countries, and I never made that mistake again of just kind of understanding what's appropriate, culturally appropriate, and how I can best represent myself. During my travels, I made a stop in France, and even though it wasn't part of my official research project, I stayed in hostels. I stayed at hostels in Singapore. I was at the YMCA, and I was in a hostel in Paris. And I found just groups of different international students There was a woman in Singapore from Norway, and she was traveling by herself. In France, there were a group of South Americans. I'm of Cuban descent and speak Spanish, and so we were all just hanging out and spent some great days. Actually, that trip to Malaysia, I was with some of the women that I met at the YMCA, and spent an entire day traveling across Paris with people that I met in the hostel, and I would have never had that experience had it not been for the Circumnavigators Foundation. The trip allowed me to really have an in-depth and appreciation of the topic. I spent a lot of time in libraries. I was able to interview a member of the House of Lords who was also a circumnavigator. Having that cultural perspective and depth is something that you can't read about, you can't watch a video about, and I feel very, very lucky to have received the Circumnavigator Scholarship. It's something that has been defining, of my my perception of myself, my worldview of the different nuances and complexities that are abound, and that need to be taken into consideration when people look at issues. It's not just black and white, right? Like, it's not, what makes Singapore Singapore and Malaysia Malaysia by, an hour bus ride away is pretty complex. And I don't think I would have had that perspective in that short of a time that richly if it had not been for the foundation scholarship. So the experience changed me as a student. Immediately, actually, the fall afterwards, I applied for a public policy and international fellow, which was funded by the Ford Foundation. And then the following summer, I actually spent at the University of Washington in Seattle. And the whole focus of that was actually economic development at a micro level. And then that helped fund, it came with this summer experience for underrepresented groups that were interested in policy. And then afterwards, it actually helped fund my graduate school. So it propelled that academia, and in a way that was broader. I'd always had an interest in government and policy. I attended Florida State so I could work in the state legislature while I was at school. So I've always been interested in that. But the fellowship, the Circumnavigators Club experience then led to my PPIA, which then helped fund graduate school. And when I started in management consulting, I actually started in the public sector because of my interest in government. And I'm the Senior Vice President of People for ReliaQuest, which is a global cybersecurity SaaS company, so software as a service. We are headquartered in Tampa, Florida, but have locations in Las Vegas, Salt Lake, Dublin, Ireland, London, Amsterdam, and we are just opening our entity in India. I'm responsible for recruiting, training, HR, comp and benefits, and joined in January of 2020 after 18 years at IBM. And we're growing rapidly, and I have to say that my perspective as a global citizen is really important to my job, especially as we expand into other countries, and having that depth of knowledge of and perspective of how we train people potentially in India versus Ireland versus the US. And even in the US, there are still nuances that the Circumnavigators Scholarship gave me a great crash course in perspective. I come from a pretty traditional family structure. My mom never worked. My dad was the sole breadwinner. And I'm one of 7 kids. And all of the women, got married at 20, had started having kids at 22, and there's nothing wrong in their path. But I was never really tested in terms of what I could do, the art of the possible. And that trip gave me an edge of fearlessness that I still have. I worked for IBM for 18 years. I traveled to India by myself, didn't miss a beat. There were things that I knew because of the trip, and then later on that allows you to be savvier in terms of a traveler. But I don't think I would have pushed myself as much if I had not had this experience. So being a global citizen of planet Earth is a constant responsibility to be responsible in our choices, whether that's from recycling to driving fuel efficient cars to at the smallest level to having a broad respect for different cultures and perspectives. Being a global citizen is always being open to travel, to understanding different perspectives, knowing that there's no one way of doing anything. And this grant provided me an experience to really have a kind of a front row access to that. And that's not something that leaves with you, even 25 years after my trip. So my advice to future scholars is don't hesitate to take the plunge, to visit countries that, even if you think they're a little risky, just jump right in and savor every second. You're going to be pushed into levels of discomfort. You're going to have to introduce yourselves and put yourselves out there, whether it's making a transaction to sitting in a common space in a hostel and getting to know other individuals from different countries. So dive right in, cherish every moment, and what you put in is what you'll get back. I would describe the Circumnavigators Foundation grant as a opportunity to pursue your interest around the world. The Circumnavigators Foundation is risk-taking individuals that have all circumnavigated the world in one continuous trip. It allows you to see a variety of cultures in one summer. It allows you to dive into your personal interest, and it pushes you personally, professionally, and academically in a way that you wouldn't be otherwise. So happy to hear that the foundation grants are still being funded and students are still taking advantage of this opportunity. It makes my heart happy. It's amazing that we've had 50 years of people doing this, and it's exciting that we're able to fund students for years to come. I feel like it's one of the proudest memberships that I have, is to be an alum of this experience. And I'm actually not connected to other folks, especially in Tampa, if there are any that are circumnavigators, and that's something that I would like to get back into.